The Bewitched King. What if I told you there was once a king so physically malformed that his own subjects believed he was hexed by the devil himself? Meet Charles II of Spain, a sovereign whose appearance was so jarring that even his royal court murmured he must be under a dark spell. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But here's the twist. Charles wasn't plagued by supernatural forces. He was cursed by something far more insidious, his own royal lineage. This is the tale of how the most formidable dynasty in Europe annihilated itself from within, forging a king so disfigured that when he finally succumbed, his autopsy unveiled horrors that seemed to validate every supernatural dread his people had whispered about for decades. And if you're prepared to delve into more startling historical enigmas that textbooks dare not reveal, hit that subscribe button, because we are just beginning to uncover the unsettling truth behind royal authority.
The jaw that wouldn't yield. When foreign emissaries first met Charles II, many could not conceal their astonishment. Here stood the king of the most powerful empire on earth, yet he couldn't even close his mouth. His jaw protruded so drastically that his lips could never meet, leaving his mouth agape like a shattered door. This was no mere accident of birth, but the unavoidable outcome of 2 centuries of the Habsburg family's darkest fixation. They termed it keeping the bloodline pure, but what they were truly engaged in was a game of genetic Russian roulette with their own descendants. The Habsburgs adhered to a simple creed: marry within the family, keep power consolidated. Cousins married cousins, uncles wedded nieces, and at times, the familial connections became so convoluted that a single individual could be their own cousin multiple times over. His parents? They were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides? Also uncle and niece. Trace it back far enough and you'll discover that Charles possessed the genetic diversity of someone whose lineage had been confined to a desolate island for generations. The result was what physicians termed mandibular prognathism, but everyone else dubbed it the Habsburg jaw. Charles's lower jaw jutted out so dramatically that even when he closed his mouth, a gap remained where you could slide a coin through. His teeth were completely misaligned. The top row sat entirely behind the bottom, rendering chewing an impossibility.
A body that defied nature. But here's where it becomes truly grotesque. Every meal transformed into a humiliating ordeal. Palace kitchens had to prepare his food like infant's mush, everything pureed, mashed, or liquefied. Even then, eating was a messy, laborious affair. Soup would dribble from the corners of his mouth, and solid food would simply fall out. Royal dinners, which should have been showcases of majesty and power, became grotesque spectacles where servants perpetually dabbed saliva from their king's chin. The worst part? His speech was nearly unintelligible. The same jaw deformity that made eating impossible turned every royal decree into a struggle. Foreign diplomats required interpreters not due to language barriers, but because they genuinely could not comprehend what the Spanish king was attempting to convey. His words emerged as wet, slurred mumbles that even his own courtiers found difficult to decipher. Palace records reveal that Charles's own mother, Queen Mariana, penned letters expressing her terror that her son might suffocate on his own tongue during his sleep. The most powerful ruler in Europe was deemed a choking hazard. And the truly horrific part? The Habsburgs were aware their marriages were yielding progressively deformed offspring, yet they persisted. Power was more vital than the physical torment of their own progeny. By the time Charles was born, he was essentially a living experiment in what transpires when human genetics go catastrophically awry. The Habsburg jaw was merely the tip of the iceberg. Charles II's entire body was a wreck, and the full scope of his deformities would have made medieval villagers cross themselves in fear. At 35, Charles resembled a sickly child who had been stretched and twisted by some cruel force. He barely reached 5 feet in height, but it wasn't just his stature that was off. His proportions were utterly skewed. the king who couldn't forge heirs. Here is where Charles II's tragic saga escalates into a continental catastrophe. The most powerful throne in Europe belongs to a man incapable of producing a single heir. Charles married twice, desperately attempting to fulfill the most fundamental duty of kingship, continuing the dynasty. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who arrived in Spain expecting to marry a king, and instead found herself shackled to what courtiers whispered was barely a man. The wedding night was reportedly a calamity. Palace servants later testified that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears, and Charles appeared bewildered and distressed. The same genetic mutations that had twisted his body had also rendered him functionally impotent. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that doctors of the era described them as infantile. Essentially, Charles had the sexual maturity of a prepubescent boy trapped in an adult's failing body. But the Spanish court could not admit this publicly. Instead, they blamed Marie-Louise for being barren, subjecting her to humiliating medical examinations and treatments. She was forced to drink repugnant herbal concoctions, undergo painful procedures, and endure the constant scrutiny of a court that desperately needed her to produce an heir her husband was biologically incapable of providing. The psychological toll was devastating. Marie-Louise, once described as vivacious and intelligent, became withdrawn and depressed. She spent her days in prayer, beseeching God for a miracle that would never arrive. Some historians suggest she may have been slowly poisoned by the stressful treatments and fertility medicines forced upon her. When Marie-Louise died mysteriously at the age of 26, Charles was swiftly remarried to Maria Anna of Neuburg. The second wedding was an even more desperate affair.
Exorcisms in the royal palace. When medical science failed to explain or cure Charles II, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural. What ensued were some of the most bizarre and disturbing religious ceremonies ever performed on a living monarch. Public exorcisms conducted in the royal palace itself. The church had a straightforward explanation for Charles's condition. He was possessed by demons. Father Furlong Diaz, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was inhabited by multiple malevolent spirits that had been placed there through witchcraft. But here's where it gets truly surreal. The exorcisms weren't conducted in some secluded chapel. These were full-scale theatrical productions held in the throne room, with nobles and foreign dignitaries compelled to watch their king writhe on the floor while priests chanted Latin incantations over his convulsing body. These ceremonies could last for hours. Charles, already frail and confused, would be subjected to aggressive physical manipulations as priests attempted to literally wrestle demons from his flesh. They would press crucifixes against his skin until he shrieked, splash him with holy water, and force him to recite prayers in Latin, a language he could barely grasp given his intellectual limitations.
The autopsy that horrified Europe. When Charles II finally passed away in 1700 at the age of 38, the Spanish court faced a moment of terrible truth. They had spent decades asserting their king was cursed by supernatural forces, but now they needed to know what had truly been inside the body of the man they called el hechizado. What the royal physicians uncovered during Charles's autopsy was so shocking that the official report was initially suppressed, deemed too disturbing for public consumption. But the details eventually surfaced, and they painted a picture of internal horror that seemed to confirm every supernatural fear his subjects had harbored for decades. Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pierola, the royal physician who conducted the examination, wrote what became one of the most horrifying medical documents in European history. According to his report, Charles's body was more like that of a monster than a man, containing organs so malformed and diseased that it seemed impossible he had survived as long as he did. His heart was no larger than a walnut, shriveled and blackened like a piece of burned meat. His lungs were described as corroded and gangrenous, and his intestines were putrefied and gangrenous. Perhaps most shocking of all was what they found in his skull. When physicians opened Charles's head, they discovered that his brain was surrounded by an abnormal amount of fluid, what we now know as hydrocephalus. His brain tissue itself appeared damaged and discolored, explaining his intellectual disabilities and erratic behavior. Dr. Pierola concluded his report with a statement that sent shockwaves through European courts. It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ. The autopsy findings were so extreme that they actually reinforced supernatural beliefs rather than dispelling them. How could someone survive with organs so damaged unless dark forces were involved? The medical evidence seemed to prove that Charles had indeed been cursed, just not in the way anyone had imagined.